I think for me, it was mainly my stubbornness, telling myself that, oh, I didn't have a problem, that I was perfectly fine. This is just a phase. I think that was like my biggest hesitation.
Welcome to Your Story Doesn't End Here, the mental health podcast for military and veterans. I'm your host, Rachel, and my mission with this podcast is to be a voice for those who don't have a voice, bring awareness to mental health issues, and provide value and solutions to help make life more abundant. Hey everyone, thank you so much for coming back for another episode of Your Story Doesn't End Here. Today's guest is Erica. She was in the Navy as a gas turbine electrical engineer for almost 13 years. She got out a little over a year ago as a first-class petty officer on a medical discharge due to having bipolar disorder type 2, hypomanic depression, and social anxiety. The only two states she spent her naval career in have been California and Virginia, and the majority of it working with LCACs or hovercrafts. She currently resides in Oregon, where she was born and raised. Erica, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I'd love to just hear your story and get into that, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, so like you said, I was in the Navy for a little over 12 years, and most of it was spent in the continental US, Virginia and California. Definitely had some good times in the Navy, but I've also had some bad times as well, like everyone has. It's where I found out that I had bipolar disorder type 2, which, like you also said, is hypomanic disorder, or I'm sorry, hypomanic depression, which means that there's a baseline that I have, and it's what my doctor had said, it was a melancholic type of personality. And then I could have an up of a manic episode, or I could go, back to my baseline and then go back down to a depression episode. It's never a quick up and a quick down like hypermanic depression is. So that's the difference between the two.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. I'm not super familiar with all the different forms of bipolar depression, bipolar disorders, and I'm sure some of the listeners aren't either. So, would you mind getting into a little bit about where in your story you discovered and how you discovered that about yourself?
Yeah, definitely. So I actually first started counseling. Oh, I think I was a third class petty officer. So I was around the age of maybe 20. I was dealing with a lot of being a functional alcoholic at the time. And one day I was talking to a friend who is currently a senior chief in the Navy. She was kind of like my mentor. She is my mentor still. And she suggested that maybe it was time that I, figured out the root of my issues instead of trying to hide it through my drinking. And so that's where I started my counseling. And then from there, it just evolved into finding counselors who were dealing with mental health, because I started to find that I was covering my depression, my anxiety through drinking. And then after that, my final naval doctor that I was talking to was the one who brought up the idea that, hey, there's a possibility you might have bipolar disorder. So that's when it came to light.
So I want to talk a little bit more about the drinking aspect and how that ensued, because I think a lot of people join the military and drinking just kind of becomes a norm. And for some people, it can evolve into a lot more of a problem. But some people join the military with it already being an excessive part of their life. So I'm curious for you how your alcohol intake kind of evolved from the time you joined the Navy until the time that you started seeking counseling and realizing that it may be an actual problem for you.
Yeah. So for me, I actually started drinking at a very young age because I hung around older kids at the time. And I must have been maybe like 14, 15 years old when I started. And that just became a norm for me. where hanging out meant partying and drinking. And then even as I first joined the Navy and everything, that also became the norm too, partying and drinking with like the other younger sailors and occasionally some, I wouldn't say older and senior, but in between where they're not way older than me, but they're not near my age. So that was, kind of like the quote unquote norm, like you were saying. And it's when I started to self harm myself when I was drinking. That's when I didn't realize at the time was an issue. But when it was mentioned to my mentor and friend, that's when, she was like, yeah, this has got to stop.
So what do you mean when you say self-harm? Was there a specific incident that happened that really brought up the concern to your mentor?
There were cuts on my arms, not suicidal cuts, but just like on the outer forearm where they weren't made from working. Cause I work with a lot of like lock wire and metal. So like sometimes my arms would get like scratched up from work, but they were deep enough to look like it was done by self.
So was that something that you were struggling with at the time?
It was definitely, it was associated with a lot of my depression.
So what was the hesitation from you before you got that push from your mentor to go seek more help? What was your hesitation for seeking more help and just kind of internalizing it with self-harm?
I think for me, it was mainly my stubbornness, telling myself that, oh, I didn't have a problem, that I was perfectly fine. This is just a phase. I think that was like my biggest hesitation.
So, what was your experience when you did seek help? Was it positive for you, or did you experience challenges in getting the help that you needed?
At first, it was challenging for my end because I wasn't very open about my issues and my situations. And I have a lot of like difficulty at that time when I was younger. I had a lot of difficulty trusting people and telling them my story. But as time went on, I found that there are people who want to help, that aren't out to, get me and try to ruin my life per se. So that's how it evolved for me.
So, I want to backtrack a little bit. How old were you when you joined the military?
I think I was 19 because I joined back in 2008.
Okay. And had you ever worked any jobs prior to the military? Was that your first job?
I worked as a cashier for the Annie Ann's pretzels.
Okay. The reason I ask is because I think, obviously everyone has their own experiences in life prior to joining the military. And I'm curious if there's any kind of correlation there between people that have worked prior, people that haven't. I'm not sure that there is. I think it really just depends on, what experiences you had in life before joining as to how, we behave when we're actually in the military service. But do you think that, and I'm not sure if maybe your mental health care team gave you more insight in this, but do you think that bipolar is something that you had dealt with prior to joining the service, or do you think that is something that developed from you being in the Navy?
Oh, I definitely think it was something from before, and I just never made a connection until I talked about it more with my counselors.
So, do you think that seeing counseling was helpful for you?
Yes, it was definitely a positive thing.
That's good to hear. And so, how did that affect you from a leadership standpoint? You said you were a first class petty officer when you got out. So, obviously, you climbed the ranks to a pretty decent level. How did your own personal mental health issues and what you were struggling with, how did that affect you as a leader? And do you think that it impacted those around you in any way?
It made things difficult for me because in the back of my head, I always thought that because I was struggling with mental health, I wouldn't be able to help others, but at the same time, I wanted to. So, yeah, it was definitely a difficult challenge for me. And me personally, I don't think I did a very good job of being a leader. I would say I gave some decent advice to my junior sailors, but as far as being there as, as that first class that they needed, I never saw myself like that.
So what would have been the definition of a good leader for you around your junior sailors at that time? What would you have expected from yourself to feel like you were a good leader?
Oh man, that is a difficult question for me to ask. At least if I was, talk about myself, but if I was that junior sailor and I, needed a leader, it would definitely be someone who was empathetic to me and my situations, someone who didn't play the favoritism game, and just someone who was there, like, work wise, life wise. Like, if I needed some advice, like as an older sister or an older brother, maybe a fatherly figure or something, because a lot of sailors don't have those types of figures in their lives. So I guess that's the type of person that I would have been seeking out.
So do you think that you fit the mold of that person that you just described when you were a leader in the military?
In my opinion, and I know, like, I'm beating myself down right now, but I don't think that.
Okay, no, and that's totally fine. That's your perception of you. And I respect that you're honest in that answer. I think this is an important discussion to have because I think when we're talking about, I know the military says you're leaders at all ranks, but realistically, I mean, they really start throwing you in the leadership roles as a second class, as a first class, E5, E6. And I think that to a certain point, it's good to be very critical of yourself because that's what makes us better and to understand what kind of leader we want or we need. And then to feel like we don't have it all figured out, I think is also okay. Because, a lot of us, we're just realistically, every single one of us, no one teaches us how to be a human. We're all just kind of figuring it out as we go. So there's no shame in that. And again, I appreciate that you shared that very personal feeling about how you felt about your military service. So I know that you had said that you separated medically from the Navy. What are your
Yes.
feelings surrounding that?
Oh gosh, I would definitely say relief. It's like a weight lifted, because now I don't have to deal with such a toxic environment, and it's so much better being home with people that understand me and want to support me.
So when you were in, you mentioned toxic environment. What did you experience? Was it like a command level where you felt that toxicity, or was it outside of the command?
It was definitely a command level. I would say ever since I left my first command, which was between 2009 and 2014, that's when my eyes were open to, a lot of the favoritism game, the good old boy club, and just like high school cliques happening again. And it wasn't really, oh, what's the word? Healing for, a person.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. How, I guess, do you think that that toxic environment affected your mental health and where you were at emotionally?
It was an extremely negative effect on me. And the longer I was in those kinds of environments, the more I was depressed and anxious and, beating myself down and just stressed out a lot. And to the point where I actually gained a lot of weight because I was so stressed.
So, do you think that the toxic work environment is what led up to the chain of events with you self-harming and excessively drinking, or was it something else?
The self-harm actually came before the Navy. I think I never realized it, but I was depressed, and it was just a way for me at that time. I thought I wasn't feeling anything, emotionally. So I needed something to feel physically. So that's where the self-harm came in. But emotional and mental parts just grew and grew the longer I stayed in those kinds of environments.
Yeah, no, you bring up a couple really good points. Something that you said earlier, you talked about how the stress led to your weight gain. And I think so many people can relate to that, especially women in the military, because, I've talked about this a few times on this show, but the weight standards are already incredibly stressful. The military leads to many eating disorders within both men and women, but I think when you're already in a stressful environment, your body already can't focus on being its healthiest. And so a lot of times that can lead to weight gain, and not having that supportive environment can often make us feel even worse about not only our weight, but knowing that, stressing out about weight standards and a PRT and the job, and it continues to add on to that stress. And so, yeah, I'm curious what your experience was surrounding that, and if you got any flack from your command about gaining weight, or if anyone tried to be supportive of you, or if that just kind of added to the challenges you're experiencing.
I didn't necessarily have a hard time with that. There were a lot of people at my last command right before I left the Navy who, were willing to help me out. But I guess I was just way too much into my stress that no matter what I tried, it didn't seem to be enough.
Yeah, I think a lot of people can relate to that feeling. What do you think would have been helpful for you? I know you mentioned a couple of key leadership things that you said you would have needed. Was there anything else that you think would have been helpful for you throughout your time when you were in the Navy?
Just good leadership would have been, really great. Someone who was actually there for me and not, hey, I'm a chief. Hey, I'm a senior chief. Well, I'm the first class, those kinds of people. Just people would have been like, hey, I'm your first class, but, if you need help, I'm here for you. Or, hey, I might be the command master chief here, but, my door is always open. Or like just something where you can connect to your leaders.
I love that. I love that. And I completely agree with you. I think that leadership is where it starts. And without good leaders, you can't have a healthy environment. So I think that's where a lot of the toxicity comes from. One of the factors of where the toxicity comes from. What advice would you have to someone who may be in similar shoes as you were when you were in, and maybe facing separating from the military?
Have a great support system. It will not help you if you are doing it by yourself. And it just brings you down even more if you get caught in your own thoughts. So definitely having a great support system, whether it's, you know, back in your hometown, at your command, or and outside of the military group of friends, just people who are willing to understand you and be there for you is, I think, one of the greatest things.
And do you have any advice about the actual separation process? I know I talked to a few people before who are experiencing, they're up for separation medically, and they're just really confused, overwhelmed. Are there any tips you have that maybe made the process a little easier for you?
So for me, definitely having everything recorded in your medical records is a big thing. And if you don't get those like copies of your primary care visits, or a special visit to like a neurologist or a podiatrist or whatever may have you, definitely get those copies and put it in your records. That's tip number one. Number two is definitely get to know your career counselors and the TAPS coordinators. They are the ones who will help you the most in trying to get your separation in order.
That's great advice. And what are you up to these days, Erica? Ever since you separated from the military, are you getting that support that you need now? And what things are you up to in your life now that you are no longer in the military?
I did some work at a motel by the beach for the summer. So that was really invigorating for me because it was away from my hometown, but at the same time, it gave me something to do. But now that I'm not doing anything, I've gone back into like a slight slump, but I will be going back to school to either become an MRI tech or a veterinarian nurse.
That is amazing. And do you have any future goals that you're working towards currently, or just taking it day by day?
I'm a day by day person. I found that if I make any goals for myself, either I set them too high or too low, and then I get frustrated at both of them.
That is fair enough. Well, Erica, thank you so much for being on the show and giving us some insight into your story, what you've been through, and what's been helpful for you. I know there's so many people that are going to get value from what you shared in your story, and I appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen in today. Each week, I'll be bringing you value in the mental health space and its direct impact on service members and veterans. If you feel you personally got value today from this episode, it would mean the world to me if you would leave a 5-star rating and review and share this to your audience. Until next time, remember, your story matters, your mental health matters, and your story doesn't end here.